Slepkov. I'm a fellow here at the Jewish People Policy Institute. We have a fine evening for you tonight. To kick us off, the president of JPPI, Professor Yedidia Stern.
Okay, good evening. Shalom, everybody. It is a pleasure and honor to host here at JPPI few ambassadors, actually. But we'll focus on the discussion between two of them. One is our co-chair, Dennis Ross, and the other is Tom Nides, the ambassador of the United States here in Israel. Our mission here at JPPI is basically to think for the long run about policies that may serve the Jewish people. This is a big thing, obviously. And we focus our activities around, I would say, four things. First of all, we would like to be the place where we accumulate data about the Jewish people. Amazingly so, there is no other place that does this in a professional, serious way. Secondly, we have a center dealing with identity, a center dealing with cohesiveness of the Jewish people within Israel, outside of Israel, and in between. And the center, which is relevant to what we are going to hear today, is a center dealing with resilience. Now, the relationship between the United States and Israel is obviously a cornerstone for the resilience of the State of Israel and the resilience of the Jewish people. Now, the strong relationship between the two states is based not only on interest, but mainly, I believe, on shared values. We are both liberal democracies. Now, in this historic moment, right now, when we are witnessing the largest state in Europe attacking the second largest state in Europe, it is clear that Israel stands side by side with the US and with the other democracies in the West. However, even friends do not always agree about everything. And I think that the Vienna Agreement, which is not yet a done deal, is one important point of possible dispute. There are gaps between the way Washington and Jerusalem see the threat from Iran. And I think that many Israelis interpret the situation as a real existential threat, a possibility for a second Shoah, chas v'chalila, on one hand. On the other, and apparently, in Washington, many people see the threat as some kind of insurance policy that the Iranian regime is trying to have for themselves, not in order to attack other people. I don't know if this is true, but this is a possible interpretation of the gap between the two nations. Now, most Israelis believe Iran when their leaders say time after time that they want to destroy us. And I think that the lesson from last week is that we have to hear what dictators say about their intentions. Putin was saying for the last 20 years that he is about to rebuild the USSR, and that's what he's trying to do, apparently. So we in Israel cannot afford not to listen and to take seriously the existential threat. And I'm sure that this issue will be part of the discussion between our very distinguished guests. So you didn't come here to hear me. So thank you very much for coming. And I hope we will learn a lot and enjoy this evening. Good evening.
Let me introduce you first. Okay. Our next speaker, I hope all of you know, Shmuel Rosner. He's a senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute. He's dressed very nice because he's going to leave us soon to go on TV, which he's been on almost 24/7 the last few days.
Yes, those of you who know, hello, thank you for, have a lovely evening. I have many friends here, and most of them know that if there wasn't an international crisis raging, I would be here in my pajamas. So there's nothing more absurd than trying to make any decisive comments when such crisis rages. So I will try to show you a few slides. I see my role here as someone who has to assist in framing several of the issues that will probably be discussed later this evening. I was never blamed for being not opinionated enough, but I will try to keep my opinions to myself and just show you the slides from which you can see some of the things that impact what we call here the triangle of the United States, Israel, and the American Jewish community. I will just say that the slides are, this is a combined analysis taken from different polls by Gallup, the Pew Research Center, the IDI, the Madad, JPPI, and other sources. So don't look for these exact slides. You won't find them. If anyone wants the slides or the exact sources, I'm happy to assist. So this is, I'll start with the good news. We often hear about two things. One, the erosion of support for Israel in the United States. The second is the huge gap between the support of voters of the two parties. As you can see in this slide, there is a gap between the two parties, but the gap goes back 20 and more years. This is an ongoing thing. It is not new. It didn't start with President Biden or President Trump, and it will probably not end with them. There is a gap between voters of the two parties concerning Israel, and in fact, if you look at the numbers, you might be able to detect the fact that the numbers for democratic support for Israel goes down when there's a Republican president. During the Bush years and later during the Trump years, we see that support for Israel slides somewhat and then rebounds and goes back to about the same level. So again, I'm not trying to minimize or disregard the fact that Democratic voters in the United States are less supportive of Israel than Republican voters, but I would say, A, this is not new, B, I'm not sure it's even growing. This is a situation that we've been facing for many years. This is very interesting. When I combine the numbers, these are numbers taken from 3 different polls, and I did not expect to find such unanimity in the views of American Jews and Israel as they assess the state of the relations between the two countries. But as you can see here, when we look at the numbers, the lighter blue is Israelis, and the purple or darker blue are American Jews. And when they are asked to assess what is the state of the relations between the two countries, you can see that it's almost identical. Again, it is surprising, somewhat encouraging. This is still the part in which I show you the good news. This is where it becomes trickier. This is an ongoing survey of Americans asking about their assessment of America's greatest enemies. That's Iran. The red line, that's Iran. And as you can see, 10 years ago, Iran was much more front and center on the minds of Americans as a real threat to the United States. But in the last decade, Iran was going down in the consciousness, in the identification of threats in the American mind, and other countries, namely China and Russia. I assume that Russia will now rise to new heights. Russia and China are becoming much more significant for Americans. Iran is of less significance. This is not true for Israelis. When Israelis look at the world and when they assess the threat to Israel, they see Iran as a much more formidable threat. They see it as even a mortal danger to Israel. That's the actual framing of the question. As we can see here, more than 50% see it as strong yes and a yes, and another quarter as a moderate yes. Iran is seen by Americans as less of a threat in the last decade, more of a threat to Israelis in the last decade. What about American Jews and Israelis when it comes to American policy on Iran? Here you can begin to see the difference between assessments. We previously saw that Israelis and Jewish Americans see the state of the relations almost identically, but when they look at Iran and their ability to, for Americans, support Israelis' trust the current president and the current administration on dealing with Iran, the trust of Jewish Americans is high, the trust of Israelis is much, much lower, and this is all Israelis, including Arab Israelis. If we were to look only at Jewish Israelis without the Arabs, it would be even lower. Whose assessment is more accurate or more appropriate under the current circumstances? This is a survey from last week in which we see the following. Only 28% of Americans today believe that a new agreement with Iran is going to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. So their level of belief in the ability of negotiations and agreements to stop Iran from achieving its goals it is relatively low. However, when Americans are asked about possible actions if discussions fail to reach an agreement, as we can see, many Americans would support sanctions or diplomacy, but fewer Americans and only a third of Americans would support a military action against Iran to prevent it from acquiring nuclear weapons. So maybe in light of these numbers, when we look at the assessment of Americans and Israelis, there is at least a way for Israelis to argue that their assessment of the situation is probably more in line with the facts than the assessment of American Jews.
Both are relating to American Jews.
No, this one is Americans. This is all Americans. This is Israelis versus American Jews. That was 6 slides in 6 minutes, as I promised Yedidia. Thank you all, and have a great evening.
Thank you, Shmuel. It is my pleasure now to move to the first slide in this presentation. To move to the main event, it's my pleasure to introduce retired Brigadier General Ruth Yarone. She is both a retired general and a former senior fellow here at the JPPI and a senior Israeli diplomat. She was the head of the Jordanian department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and in 2002, she was named a spokesperson for the Israeli Defense Force with the rank of Brigadier General. As such, she became the first woman to be a member of the General Staff. Our main guest, I will spend a couple more seconds introducing him because he's new to the JPPI community. Everyone else is quite familiar here. So, Ambassador Thomas Nides is the U.S. Ambassador to Israel. He is a distinguished public servant as well as a business leader. Recently, he was the managing director and vice chairman of Morgan Stanley, and previously he was the U.S. State Department's Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the former chairman of the board of the Woodrow Wilson Center, appointed by President Barack Obama. And our third speaker, who I'd like to invite all three of you to come to the front. Our third speaker needs no introduction. He is the co-chair of the Jewish People Policy Institute, now a prolific author, and of course everyone knows him as an excellent diplomat and negotiator. Please.
And it's good to be, wow, that's strong. And it's good to be here together tonight to discuss some of the most important topic that we are witnessing in these days. I think that we could not have chosen a better moment to meet and to discuss not only U.S.-Israel relationship, but a little bit of the state of the world, not the state of the Union, but the state of the world. In French, we say, plus ça change, plus ça reste la même chose. The more it changes, and the more it stays the same. And in a sense, we are seeing new phenomenon that some of them really remind us of old phenomenon, and we are not sure yet at this moment, are we witnessing a reshaping of maybe a new world order, or rather we are going back to a world order where force, even brute force, is the key token and not other. 30 years ago, when I arrived to the embassy in Washington, and later on Ambassador Zalman Shoval came to the embassy, the concept that was put forward after the Berlin Wall tumbling down and the end of the Cold War was soft power. And when Joseph Nye was talking about the soft power and introducing the concept to our diplomatic world, we were looking at this as a token of the new era. Then the big discussion was Francis Fukuyama sort of arguing against Samuel Huntington Clash of Civilization and asking, is this the end of history? But I'd rather go to Robert Frost and asked, did we take the road not taken, or are we back at the road we know too well, to go back to war, to go back to force, to go back to a kind of diplomacy, even in this global world and in this global economy, where whoever has the bigger stick is calling the shots. And this is right not only for what's going on right now in Ukraine, but definitely when we are looking at Iran, and I think that what Shmuel have shown us in those slides describe exactly the Israeli sentiment. So to discuss the triangle of Washington, Jerusalem, and the American jury, we will first open the scope and talk a little bit about what's going on these days, and then narrow it down to the triangle. And I would like to start with you, Ambassador Nides, and have your insights about the situation right now in Ukraine, and looking at it from a perspective not only to ask the question of whether a new world order is being formed here, or we are going back 30, 40, and even more, many years back, but also to ask the question of what can we, and we, I'm hesitant of saying the West, because the delineating factor is not only the East and the West, but what can we do about it? And whether the economic sanction that right now President Biden and the EU are heading will suffice, will be enough to create a change on the ground.
Well, first of all, hello? Hello? Okay, it works? Okay. First of all, thank you very much. I'm honored to be in your presence, and obviously You have a distinguished career, so I'm sure there's nothing I could say that possibly you have not heard before. But being in your presence and being with my friend Dennis's presence is a little intimidating even for the American ambassador, because as you might already know, all of you know this, Dennis is a legend in Washington, D.C., and a legend in anyone who happens to be a diplomat at any point. I think Dennis was probably the first person I talked to when I got nominated for this job. Dennis came over to my house. I've called Dennis dozens of times to get his advice, his counsel, his thoughts, and you're lucky to have him part of this institution. We're actually more lucky to have him part of any policy-making discussion. So, again, I'm really honored to be with my pal, and thank you very much for having me. Listen, it's a tragedy. I can't. It's a tragedy. Is not even a word to describe it. I've had the Ukrainian ambassador in my office multiple times in the last week. I've had hundreds of conversations with Israeli officials about what they can do and how they should do it. At the end of the day, Putin is a madman. And sadly, thousands of people could be killed. Hundreds of thousands of people have fled, creating one of the largest refugee crises Europe has seen in probably 40 years, if not longer. I can't even begin to describe, I think, what we're unfolding in front of our eyes. I don't think any of us envisioned this, to be honest. I don't think, our vaunted intelligence operations were projecting this to happen, and I think many of us believed it would never happen, that no one would be that crazy, that no one would actually execute this. This was like a big bluff. And I think the Biden administration made this decision that, in fact, wasn't a bluff. And the strategic decision, as Dennis knows, to basically articulate intelligence early and often had never been done before, the way they decided to do this. And for one of the reasons is to create a clear view of what could happen and to rally the international community. I can't use the word silver lining in anything that causes thousands of people to potentially be dead and millions of people to flee. But what you're witnessing in Europe and in the world coming together to show in unity against Putin and Russia is beyond, I think, any of our imaginations. I think if you would have told me or any of us in this room that every one of our European colleagues will be placing sanctions on Russia in the way they have done at their own peril, at their own cost, I don't think any of us would imagine this. And it crosses all sectors. It covers all economies. And I think what you are seeing for the first time in a very, very long time is the world is speaking with one voice. And if that is a message not only to Putin, and Dennis will, I'm sure, have a view on this, it's also a message to the other people out there in the world who are thinking about doing bad things. I know we'll talk about Iran in a minute, and certainly the ideas around China and as they see how the world can rally together to stop atrocities. It's not going to stop Putin from killing a lot of people, but the implications on Russia and on the Russian people is going to be significant, and our enemies will watch very closely as we proceed. So I'm not a particularly religious guy, although I am the ambassador to Israel. I do think we all should take a moment tonight to pray a little bit for these poor men and women and kids who are going to die for no reason whatsoever. So I'll hand it to Dennis.
Well, people are going to die. And the big question to you, Dennis, is to look at the leadership of the United States. Definitely a big achievement in rallying the world, but is there more than we can do to prevent this? Are we looking at a potential third world war, or a world war wire, as Thomas Friedman coined it. And is this going to be enough with the economic sanction and with rallying the rest of the world? And indeed, this is one of the achievements of Putin, of really gluing together all of the other camp. Is this going to be enough? Is there more than we can do so that not so many people will die and a land will be grabbed? And again, an invasion, as we are seeing it in front of our eyes every hour.
Well, first, let me thank Tom for being here, for giving excessively generous words about me. He exaggerates. But he's prone to that because with his friends, he's very generous. So you're lucky that he's
and we all know that he's right. Yeah. We agree with him.
I don't know about that, but at least on me, what I do know is that Israel is lucky that he's America's ambassador to Israel because he feels an emotional connection. He understands the importance of the relationship. He understands the context in which Israelis live, meaning he understands the predicament and the character of this region. And he is someone who is authoritative. We have two of my former colleagues who I spent a lot of time dealing with sitting at this table. And one of the things that both Danny and Zalman know is when you're an ambassador, what you need is the credibility of those you're dealing with knowing that what you say is authoritative. And in this case, you can absolutely count on that. So in answer to the question, I want to answer really both parts of the question, because the first part, before what you posed to Tom, focused on, are we seeing a reversion to the Cold War? Are we seeing a fundamental change and almost a paradigm of what's possible in terms of world order? And I think what Tom pointed out, which is very important to keep in mind, no way did Putin think that he was going to unify NATO the way he has. His whole purpose was not only to establish again a sphere of influence that was, in a sense, a recreation of the Eastern Bloc, but it was also to play upon what he felt for sure would be fissures within NATO over how to respond. And the fact that we have Germany doubling their defense budget, not just acting on stopping Nord Stream, not just going along with the idea of denying Russian banks access to SWIFT, providing weapons to Ukraine. This is something 1 week ago or less we would not have predicted. We would not have predicted that Finland would be providing arms to Ukraine. We would not be predicting that Sweden would be the same, and the two of them now are talking about wanting to join NATO. Rather than creating fissures, what he's done is he has cemented a Western alliance against him. Now, why do I mention this? Because it gets back to what Tom was saying. One of the fundamental aims of the Biden administration in a sense, releasing a lot of this intelligence very early was to shape how to think about the issue, was to put Putin on the defensive with the expectation he would understand the cost to him of acting were going up. It didn't succeed in deterring him because he so fundamentally misread the reality. He greatly exaggerated the strength of his own forces because he believes his own mythology about Ukraine not being an independent country, not having any independent identity. So here we have the irony of him believing that's the case, and therefore, when Russia went in with their own version of shock and awe, the regime was going to collapse and the people would say, welcome. And instead, he's going to end up killing the very people he says are part of Russia. So that is going to add to his difficulties, by the way, within Russia. Now, will he not go ahead and escalate? No, he's going to. It's clear he is. And probably the Grozny rules are going to apply, meaning there's going to be scorched earth. You're asking, is there more that can be done to stop this? Yes, you can run much greater risks in terms of direct conflict with Russia. One of the things that the Biden administration has done successfully is to take the leadership and mobilize the rest of the world. Will there be those who want to provide more direct support? Yeah. It's going to be hard because what was surprising to me was that the Russians couldn't create air superiority, couldn't control, couldn't dominate the airspace, and therefore also couldn't dominate the borders. Now, it's still hard for me to believe that at some point they won't be able to do that, but it's clear to me that the price of them doing it will be quite high. Will Putin at some point decide that, he has to cut his losses? He's not behaving that way yet. I interpreted the nuclear alert as his way of trying to deter the Europeans and others from resupplying. Trying to say, look, see how dangerous it is. But that was actually a reflection of his weakness, not his strength. So do I think that, President Biden's been very clear. We're not going to have American forces fighting Russians there. I don't think, but then again, I wouldn't have predicted that we would have Europeans going as far as they're going right now. We may see lots of volunteers going to Ukraine, and from all over. And that, that reality
volunteers going to fight together with the Ukrainian army?
You see the people volunteering and signing up, and Zelensky has basically done away with visa provisions. Anybody who comes can sign up. I've seen that there are some Israelis who have volunteered to go. It's clear there are, ironically, lots of Europeans who are volunteering to go. This is a phenomenon we've actually seen in the past, and it could lead to more direct intervention. I don't expect that. I think the key is going to be if we can do as much as we can to continue to get resupply in there so that the cost to the Russians of what they're doing, not just the sanctions cost, but the cost of the war itself goes up. Look, this is still largely a conscript army. It's very clear that they have morale problems. And so at a certain point, that reality is something that Putin can't ignore. I think the issue is timing. He's going to try in another week or so to hope that he produces a collapse by doing what he's done before, trying to create a kind of mass panic above the civilian population and hope that they all flee. I think he's going to be wrong again. Yes, people are going to leave in even larger numbers. The refugee crisis is unlike anything we've seen. It exceeds what we saw in the former Yugoslavia. So we're going to see more of that, but we're also seeing the resolve of the Ukrainians. They're going to fight. They're going to resist. Yes, there are going to be a lot of people who die, including Russians, who didn't need to die. And that's because of Putin. But in terms of, are we going back to a Cold War? Well, maybe we're going back to a war that is not going to be globalized, at least with the Russians, in the same way. But something Tom said, I think, bears keeping in mind. What are the lessons the Chinese are going to draw from this? They've been, yes, they're supportive of the Russians to a point. So they don't call it an invasion. But, they're also trying to walk a kind of line that isn't quite completely in the Russian camp. And the worse it gets for the Russians, maybe he'll still be supportive of them financially in some ways. Although one thing about the Chinese, they don't grant. Yeah, I was going to say, there's, it's a, at the time of this Crimean sanctions, so they did a big deal with the Russians for a pipeline and on buying their oil and their gas. And basically the deal they cut was below market prices. So they didn't cut them any big advantages here. So it'd be very interesting to watch. And Putin's going to be in need of help, and he's not going to have too many who are going to be coming to his aid. The fact that what we may start calling it the free world again, really has coalesced, that speaks kind of volumes, and that will also have implications for the Chinese.
China is definitely a very attentive spectator, but China is definitely a very attentive spectator, but I think that another very attentive spectator would be Iran. And I'd like to turn to the bully in our neighborhood, not too far from us, and the Vienna discussion at the JCPOA. So the question now becomes not only what's going on and what are the prospects for a possible agreement, and what type of agreement, what would be the main line of this agreement. Are we going for the less for less, or are we going for something else? But I think that it raises also the question about what goods are any agreements at all. I mean, again, looking back at Russia and Ukraine, and we could go back to the Budapest Memorandum, and we could go back to other agreements and ask, okay, but once those agreements are breached, what can we do? I mean, if everybody is playing by the rules, that's fine. But if somebody is saying, that's it, I'm not playing by the rules, what good is it? And then again, the question of sanctions. So if we look at Iran a little bit, Ambassador Nides, about the prospect of reaching an agreement and what type of an agreement, and also a little bit about will agreement be enough and will sanction be enough in maybe this new future we are beginning today?
Well, first of all, it's a great question. And so let me tee it up, and I'm sure Dennis will have a view of this as well. Number one, obviously I'm heavily engaged in this daily. Obviously, the Ukrainian issue has been in the news, but make no mistake, the administration can walk and chew gum at the same time, and we have many people focused on Iran and these negotiations and doing the thing that Joe Biden said he would do when he got here or got to the presidency, was he would not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Full stop. He would not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. He then was very clear that he wanted to find a diplomatic answer to this crisis. Not at any cost, but to find a diplomatic answer to this. And so we began the negotiations with the Iranians. Remember, without being partisan, because this is a bipartisan crowd, we're at basically breakout right now. For all practical purposes, are we a week away, a day away, an hour away? It's unclear, but they basically have the ability to have breakout at 90%. And not to be a nuclear physicist and get into all the details of what they're capable or capacity is, but that is where we are today. And we could debate for a long period of time, and many people in this room have been involved in these discussions. We're involved in the JCPOA, and I'm sure many of you in this room agreed with the former Israeli government on not going forward on the JCPOA. I'm not here to relive the reality. I'm here to just to say to you where we're at right now is a very, very big problem. So the question is, what do you do about it? Not what could have been or should have been or what should be, is what do you do about it? And that is the discussion that we're having with the Israelis on an hourly basis. I will tell you one thing is for certain. There is no question that there's complete transparency with the Israelis on what's going on in Vienna. I am not in any way suggesting that they like it, just to be clear. The Prime Minister has been very clear about that. The Foreign Minister has been clear about it. But unlike what happened in the Obama administration, I was part of that, just to be clear, there's no surprises here. They're not going to wake up tomorrow morning and there will be signed an agreement they knew nothing about, if that in fact gets to that place. So that is very important, because our intelligence committee, our intelligence operations, and our military operations are completely locked. One of my biggest surprises here when I got here is how close we are militarily and intelligence-wise between Israel and the United States. So there's no air between the two. So what happens? Do I think there's going to be a deal? I think there's clearly a trend that the Iranians would like to get a deal now. And I will tell you this, what's happening in Russia may have an impact on how serious sanctions work, could have huge implications. Number two, one of the reasons why, after they blew up the JCPOA, they could not get snapback back. As you know, the former Prime Minister Netanyahu tried to get the Trump administration to try to convince the Europeans to do dramatic snapbacks to sanctions. And the Europeans, they went along with some of it, but it was nowhere near what we expected to have happened, because guess what? They felt we ripped up the JCPOA and they weren't going to be a part of this. Now, they were part of the sanction regime, but nowhere near what you're seeing today. So one of the things is what the Biden administration has done is work very closely with the Europeans to try to figure out some deal that they would stay together, because if the Iranians, to your point, don't agree to the agreement, after they agree to an agreement, we now have the Europeans together on a sanctions regime that could be dramatically better than it was the post to JCPOA. So, what possible deal could be? It's still negotiating. There's still a whole bunch of things, details that will need to be worked out. I am not convinced we will get there. But to be clear, the idea is to delay the breakout period to a period of time. How long that would be has been reported. Who knows? But it could be 8 months, a year, whatever the breakout time could be. And the question is going to be, for us, which we've told the Israelis, we are in no way ever tying the hands of the Israelis on for taking action that they'll need to take to protect Israel and to do the things that they need to do. So that has been clear from the onset. So, not to get into the details of a negotiation in front of all of you, because then probably I'll get fired, but to say our fundamental view is the same. We'd like a diplomatic solution. We'd like to delay the breakout. We would like to delay the possibility of them ever getting a nuclear weapon and allowing the Israelis to have the freedom of action that they will need to take to make sure nothing happens vis-a-vis Iran and Israel.
So just to be clear on one point that you mentioned, do you think that the Biden or the Washington leadership in rallying right now the sanction and the European and Europe altogether against Russia might serve as a deterrent for Iran, as a motivating factor for them to reach an agreement, or rather to walk away?
Again, I don't get in the minds of the Iranians would be dangerous for any of us. Maybe Dennis has a better sense than I do. But let me just tell you something. They're watching something happen that hasn't ever happened in 40 years, which is all of Europe and most of the world are rallying around doing something vis-a-vis the Russians. So if I'm sitting in Iran and realizing the economy is in tatters, and you see the consequences of not trying to find a solution to this, it's not a risk they want to take. And again, details yet to follow, but I think it is imperative that everyone understands the goal here is to stop the Iranians from achieving a nuclear weapon, or at least the capabilities of creating a nuclear weapon, because all of you know it's not just the idea of getting to 90% enrichment. You have to take that and put it on something, and that's not easy, and that's complicated, and that doesn't happen overnight. But as we all know, we are very close to having a enriched uranium situation in Iran that I think none of us wants to see, and we want to delay that as much as possible.
Thank you. So Prime Minister Bennett said this morning, one eye on Kiev, one eye on Vienna, but he also said, and if an agreement is reached, it's not binding Israel. And this has been Israel's position clearly all along. So the big question is, when you look, Dennis, at the situation unfolding and whether an agreement will be reached, yes or no, and in which type of form of agreement being reached in Vienna, what would be the ramification both to U.S.-Israel relationship and here for us in the Middle East? How you see this unfolding?
Well, first, I mean, on the issue of if there is an agreement, we're not going to see a deterioration in the U.S.-Israeli relationship. On the contrary, I think the administration will be even more sensitive to some of the concerns that the Israelis have. But I want to frame really what the differences are without getting into enormous detail, which I could easily do, and I don't want everybody to go to sleep while I do it, okay? Let me describe fundamentally what the gap is, and without getting into one level of detail. On the American side, there is a recognition that there's no deal. The Iranian program will accelerate even more, and they will get to 90%. And we will not have the IAEA in there the way they have been. They're certainly not there now in the way they were supposed to be. And once the Iranians enrich to 90%, they can disperse it. And no one is going to know where it is. So then they have weapons-grade material in Iran hidden away where none of us know where it is. That's not a scenario that either we or Israel should want. And that's one of the strongest motivations to get the deal to stop, to halt them where they are, and then to basically get them back to most limitations. Now, there's a problem. The problem is that starting in 2025, they will be able to replace all their old centrifuges with their new ones. They have used the last 2 years to perfect the advanced centrifuges, of which they have like 5 different models, which are, some are 20 times as efficient. Now the problem with that is that actually reduces their breakout time starting in 2025. The quicker they can do that. So you have this issue on the one hand of, okay, if we don't stop the program, we know they're going to be able, they're going to push ahead, because for one thing, if we don't do the deal, the Iranians are going to try to prove a point to us. Okay, you didn't do the deal, you had a chance to do the deal, we're going ahead, all out. And my guess is they go 90% as a way of proving a point. Their former negotiator, Jalili, is saying, let's do 90% now. And once we do 90%, then we'll talk to the Americans. All right, so that's one pathway. The real problem, I think, that concerns most Israelis is not just what I just described about the breakout time as it relates to 2025 and the advanced centrifuges. The real problem is you're going to give Iran all these billions more in terms of resources, and they're causing all this problem in the region now without those resources. And so from an Israeli standpoint, and frankly from the standpoint of others in the region, you're basically empowering the Iranians to threaten us dramatically more. If the Houthis are hitting the Saudis, multiple times a week, and we're hitting the UAE before, imagine what more they can do. Hezbollah will get, a big shot in the arm in terms of much more monies again from the Iranians. So that's, I think, the concern here. Now, the way I square that circle is to say, all right, let's take a page from the Iranian book. The Iranians say the nuclear file is here and everything else is separate. We can do terrorism, we can do the region, we can do ballistic missiles. Our position should be, okay, the nuclear file is here, and whatever you do in the region, we're going to work with our friends and we're going to counter you. And we're going to raise the cost to you. And by the way, what we do now sends a message that to the Iranians, maybe they will do that. Maybe they will mobilize much more. Here, it can't be only diplomatic. Here, we have to use CENTCOM. Here, we take advantage of doing exercises with Israel where we rehearse the kind of options we would employ against Iran directly if they cheat, or after 2030 if they move towards a weapon. The point is, you're going to buy time. You can debate here how much time you're buying. The assessment here in Israel is you're only buying 2.5 years. The assessment in Washington is you buy till 2030. And my argument is, okay, tell me what you're going to do with the time. If you're going to use the time to build a deterrent to affect the Iranian calculus, because we're going to show them, we're going to compete with you. We're going to make you pay a price. We're going to work with the countries here. We're going to counter the threats you make. Then you're likely to change Iran's behavior.
Can I just
Sure.
Just jump in 1 second? Because obviously, Dennis is obviously, like always, spot on. I want to just reemphasize a point that's very important. You asked the question of would this exchange change the relationship with the Bennett government with the U.S. He has been very clear about his opposition as it relates to the negotiations as they currently stand. And I doubt with my heart that he will be standing up at any time, anyone in this government, and supporting whatever comes out of Vienna. But I really do believe that he believes that he is focused on the day after to Dennis, the day after an agreement is potentially signed. And he believes the relationship with the United States is critical to that success, including what Dennis has pointed out to is the proxies. Because I fundamentally believe, as the ambassador here, that the threat to the security of the state of Israel is actually more significant on the proxies than it is actually with Iran. Because ultimately the impact of the ability for Israel to defend itself is about working with the U.S., with intelligence sharing, with military cooperation, as it relates to what goes on in Syria and in Lebanon, with Hezbollah, and working together. And that will not change, to Dennis's point, which is, quite frankly, what they do if they get a deal. And I am in no way suggesting a deal is happening anytime soon. It could, but I'm not predicting it, but I will say that Dennis is right. What they do in that period of time between if there is a deal and what dates they decide, I will say is obviously 2030, but we can debate all the issues about what centrifuges get turned on, which turned off, how that all works, and Dennis can go very deep on this, and I can go not as deep as him, but that's not worthy of anyone's insomnia tonight. But I do think it is imperative to understand that this Prime Minister and this government understands the importance of the bilateral relationship, and I do believe, even though that Bennett will be aggressive on his opposition, will do nothing to shatter that relationship.
And I just want to reinforce this one point. You're buying time. So the question is, what do you do with the time? And that's what the focus should be. The U.S. and Israel together should be strategizing, assuming there's a deal, because there may not be a deal. But assuming there's a deal, we should immediately be strategizing, all right, how do we take advantage of this time to increase the deterrent against Iran, to raise the cost to the Iranians of what they're doing in the region? Which, by the way, do you do that, you'll deter them on the nuclear issue as well.
So clearly, the message of buying time, whether it's 2.5 years or whether it's more, is important. And what do we do with the time that we bought is clearly very important. That point is well made and well understood. I'm not sure, and here I would like you to clarify a little bit, the linkage with the question of the proxies. I mean, what kind of tools, what kind of what can we do, what can the United States do in linking the nuclear agreement with what I call the bully in our region, and how do we make sure that indeed all the funds that they get will not go to there? Here, this linkage is not very clear to me.
All right, so the first thing you do is you sit down, the two of us, but not just the two of us. We have a different region now. And by the way, Israel is in CENTCOM, which means you have an umbrella where we can be orchestrating things between Israel and the Arab states. So I'll give you one example of one thing you could do within CENTCOM that we have found it difficult to do before, but I think we have a different opportunity now, not only because Israel's in. We could create an integrated missile and air defense system of the whole region, which, by the way, works not just against the Iranians, it works against the proxies. We can do much more in the early warning area in terms of sharing it, and so that every missile launch we know of and every partner knows of it. We can do more in terms now, working collectively, to counter the drone threat. So what we can do is, this basically blunts what they can do. We can do much more in this regard. Now, that's mostly defensive, but it raises a cost to them. Obviously, you can create, in CENTCOM again, different kinds of scenarios for how you go ahead and you act. Israel, one of the reasons Israel's been sensitive about how to deal with the Russians is because they're right next door. And they can make it very difficult for Israel to continue to conduct the operations it conducts within Syria, which are geared at preventing Hezbollah from being able to put precision guidance on tens of thousands of rockets. And so this is an example. When Israel says, and the administration says Israel will have freedom of action, they make their own choice. Part of our challenge is basically is this a model that can be applied not only to Syria? You know, the idea that the Houthis can be firing at the UAE and at Saudi Arabia, now obviously the Saudis have retaliated, but you know, the idea that they can be doing this and the price they pay is minimal, I think it's worth taking a hard look at that. Now it's true, I'll say one other thing. The Iranians have always been prepared to fight to the last of their proxies. They're quite willing to sacrifice them. I'm not sure the proxies are always willing to be sacrificial lambs. You look at what Nasrallah said when he was asked the question about if Israel hit Iran and would they retaliate against Israel, and he said, well, the Iranians will know how to handle this. It was an interesting statement by him.
Okay, we could go deeper on this because I think it's extremely not only important but interesting. But I think I want to move on to our third topic, which is directly related to that, and that when we are looking at the triangle of Washington, Jerusalem, and the American Jewry, and of course the question of Iran is very pertinent to that, we have to take a closer look at the internal social and political climate in both Israel and the United States. And Shmuel have shown us in some of his slides, we've seen a little bit what's going on vis-a-vis Israel within the Democratic Party, within the Republican Party. But as an Israeli, one of the cornerstones of the strategic partnership between Israel and the United States was the bipartisanship. The fact that Israel was approved and accepted and supported by both aisles, and not only by one party and not the other. Now we are standing again here too in sort of an historic moment. The government in Israel does not resemble anything else that we've seen before, and is really a sort of a very interesting and I think a very positive attempt to have in one government different opinion and working together on the same agenda. And we see what's going on right now in the United States in the post-Trump era, and what's both socially and economically and of course politically. And then the big question, or I would add to that another point before the question. Some of the American jury leadership were saying that the American jury has a sort of a PTSD syndrome after the 2015 speech of then Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu in Congress, when the Jews of America found themselves really between a rock and a hard place. So when we are looking at all of this, the question has to, I want to go to the strategic partnership between the United States and Israel, but in the light both of the American jury and what can be done to make sure that the shared value that we share strategically are not harmed by different interests and different tactics, as we see maybe possibly right now vis-a-vis Russia. And its aggression, and the expectation from the Israeli government may be to have a much clearer voice on this. So looking from the American jury point of view a little bit about U.S.-Israel partnership.
Well, let me just, I don't get to do politics anymore because I'm an ambassador, but just off the record, in front of the camera. I don't buy it, okay? Meaning the relationship with Israel, in my humble view, is as solid as it's been in a long time. You have a president of the United States, Joe Biden, who has had more experience vis-a-vis Israel on every single battle around foreign assistance, on every conflict that Israel has had. He probably knows more about the U.S.-Israel relationship than any dead or alive president, okay? And he, by the way, calls himself a Zionist. He cares deeply in his gut about this place. So you start at the top. So he is the head of the Democratic Party. He's the president of the United States. So I have an enormous amount of confidence in that. Number two, if you look at the slide that was seen, which just basically shows the consistency of the slide over years, the relationship between Israel and the Democrats and Israel and the Republicans are basically been the same for the last 20 years. And people always make a lot of hay of a few voices, some loud voices, who basically make comments about Israel, and it upsets people. And then they say, oh, my God, the erosion of the support among the Democratic Party with Israel, it's ridiculous, okay? There's a few voices. And by the way, they have every right to speak out. This is a democracy in Israel. You guys are big boys and girls. You can handle it. Because now if it borders line in anti-Semitism, then we can crush them like a bug. But beyond that, we should be aware of the voices out there, and we should not stick our head in the sand. The people of Israel should not say, oh, we have heard that before, we're going to ignore that. No, the Israelis should be smart enough to understand there's a whole generation of kids that are in college now and high school now that do not have the affinity or understanding of Israel and the threats of this country and the importance of this country in the region that my kids have, and certainly your kids have. So the Israelis need to understand the importance of the continuation of the education. So they can't be paralyzed by the criticism. But on the other hand, you can't stick your head in the sand and don't think some of the criticism is not warranted. And by the way, the Israelis wouldn't want it any other way. Israel is a democracy. Israel is the beacon in this region of democratic values. There's a reason why people pick on Israel. There's a reason why people pick on the United States. They're afraid of them. They look around and say, wow, that's something. It's the startup nation. It's a democracy. So I am of this view. I think we spend way too much time talking about, oh my God, the little divisions. Okay, there's some of that, but historically it's fine. We cannot be stupid enough to stand by and think that we shouldn't think about it and make sure that we do things. That is why, as the American ambassador, I constantly talk about this unbreakable bond. I talk about how important it is. I also say I really believe in the vision of a two-state solution, because the strength of Israel as a democratic Jewish state, in my humble view, and the position of this administration, rests on making sure that we keep a vision of a two-state solution alive. Part of that is just what we believe is good for this continuation of a strong democratic Jewish state, but also, in fact, helps whatever political ideas are out there vis-a-vis what people believe Israel should or shouldn't be. So more than you asked for, but I'll give you a little bit of my point of view.
Thank you very much. But then, Dennis, you've been not only a witness of those relationships, but you were a key player in those strategic relationships. So is it really the same? I mean, as Ambassador Nides said, we whine a lot, but basically things are good and no need to worry? Or did things really change over the years, and the erosion of the bipartisanship of Israel in Congress, as well as what it does to the Jewish community, things are changing?
I could say yes. I mean, it's all true. But it also helps to have a little bit of historical perspective. The fact is, there was a time when it was the Republicans who were seen as anti-Israeli, and it was the Democrats who were the strong Israeli supporters. So the fact that we've had a political pendulum swing, first of all, is not that unusual, so we should not lose sight of that, number one. Number two, the bonds that tie us together are, as Tom was saying, very powerful. And in a sense, one of the interesting things about the Abraham Accords, when those who want to sort of single out Israel in a negative way, usually I say quite hypocritically, and those who even want to try to delegitimize it, isn't it interesting, those who want to boycott Israel aren't the Arabs. You know, when I came up on this and I was working to try to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict, if I had said to people, well, we got 6 Arab states that are at peace with Israel, what does that say? You know, when I speak, you know, when I go back from here, I'm spending 4 days going around campuses. And I typically say, you know, look, the people who are the strongest critics of Israel on campus are people who want to export the conflict from the region to the campus. I've spent 30 years trying to solve the conflict, and they want to perpetuate it here. You know, they don't want dialogue. They want boycotts. And usually when you offer that kind of a position, it's because your own position is pretty weak. And so you kind of have to make a lot of noise and divert attention. Now, having said all that, are there some signs that we should be aware of? As Tom said, don't have your head in the sand? Yes, because there is a younger demographic that didn't grow up with the crucibles that created the connections. And there's a narrative that's out there that raises basic questions. One of the reasons I do so much on the campus is it's precisely because what they hear on the campus portrays Israel in a very different way. And we have to be mindful of that. Look, Tom described the administration as, you know, continuing to embrace the image of the two-state solution as an outcome. The implication, by the way, was also not just that ultimately it helps to preserve Israel as a Jewish democratic state, it's that this isn't going to be achievable anytime soon. And by the way, it doesn't matter what the Israeli government is, it's not achievable anytime soon because the Palestinians are incapable of it. And if we had a Palestinian state tomorrow, it would be a failed state. We don't need one more failed state in the Middle East. We know what failed states produce. So partly you have to tell that story. But I would say to all my Israeli friends here, when you take 2 states off the table, that leaves only 1 state. And when you leave only one state out there as the focal point of discussion, then Palestinians are going to say, fine, one person, one vote. Now, for progressives, who, in fact, this gets to the heart of what Tom was saying, they don't have a bigger appeal right now on this issue. But if two states is off the table and one state is the only outcome, and the Palestinians say one person, one vote, well, then the progressives are going to have a much larger constituency that they'll appeal to. Now, when I say that, as I just said, the idea that two states is available anytime soon is a complete illusion. It's a complete illusion. And what has to happen is we're going to have to change the circumstances. We're going to have to change the realities on the ground. And I think the idea of, again, trying to ensure that the day-to-day existence of Palestinians improves is one way to do that. But we also have to work from the top down through the Arab states. One of the interesting things about the Abraham Accords, look how it's changed Egypt and Jordan. It wasn't just these other states that signed up. We now have Egypt acting in a way that we have not seen. I mean, the military relationship had improved, yes, but the idea suddenly, you know, you have your Minister of Energy that goes to a conference in Cairo, and Sisi makes a point of going over there to embrace this minister. He was deliberately sending a signal from the top, we're being different with the way we deal with Israelis. And Jordan, it's more complicated in some respects, but the same there. They have, the Abraham Accords created, in a sense, an incentive, a cover, but also an incentive to do more. They will not be the last Arab states. And part of the challenge is to do more to bring Arab states along. And as the outreach towards Israel from the Arab states increases, there will be some greater incentive also to do things towards the Palestinians. And that's ultimately the way you'll break the stalemate, but it also is ultimately the way the Palestinians will have to ultimately be accountable. This is what, you know, I've said this from the time I was a negotiator. The Palestinians will have a state when they're prepared to assume real responsibility and accountability. And, you know, maybe it's not going to happen right now, but don't lose sight of the fact that the Arab states can play a role in this in a way that they never ever did before.
I absolutely agree that the Abraham Accord could set the stage for a future Israeli-Palestinian deal or agreement, as long as we don't lose sight of the two-state paradigm. I agree. But I think that here in Israel, we all know are other voices, and we have to close now. I know we will be finishing in 3 minutes, just 3 more minutes, okay? But I think...
He was a general, just for record.
Was I too harsh? I was trying to say it with a smile.
You took command. Now I understand why. You took command.
I think that as an Israeli, I don't mind and I'm not afraid of disagreement with the United States, be it on the JPPI or on Russia or on the Palestinian issue, as long as I know that the disagreements are within the family, meaning that the strong strategic partnership is there, and then, you know, we can argue. And I think that most of my fellows American Jews would like to see the same thing, that if we are arguing within the family and the strategic partnership is strong, that's fine. We can deal with this, and this is extremely important for Israel to take any risk, especially a security risk, when it goes and make certain agreement in light of the regions that we are living in. And the second thing that I think is very important for me as an Israeli, and also to my fellow Jews in the United States and elsewhere, is that to understand that interest and policies are tools to achieve a higher goal, a higher strategic, and the strategic compass has to be moral value. And I think that oftentimes the criticism that I, as an Israeli, hear from American Jews, my friends, they are saying, you are not being a clear moral voice. Let's say on the issue of Russia. First state the obvious, first state the higher moral value, and then we can differ on question of tactics and policies. So it's hard to break and to stop the conversation here, but I would love for each of you, gentlemen, to leave us on, I don't want to say a happier note or an optimistic note, but one message, one important message that you would like to leave us with tonight.
Well, before that, there are, I'm sorry to interrupt this great conversation, but we do have with us two ambassadors of Israel to the United States, Danny Ayalon and Ambassador Zalman Shuval, Ambassador Danny Ayalon and Ambassador Zalman Shuval. So we're going to ask them to ask a question.
Okay, so hold your message for the final.
I don't have questions, but I have answers, but I won't, I'm not sure I'm going to mention them. First of all, really welcome again, Ambassador Nides. I saw on your record that you're an ex-banker. I think bankers make very good ambassadors. And Dennis, I wouldn't just call him the master of foreign policy. I would call him the master of understanding foreign policy, and that's even more important. There is, first of all, I'd like to say there has been a need for a full-time ambassador. So I really welcome you also in that respect. As all the three of you said, and Ruth knows what I think, and I usually know what she thinks, although a number of years have passed, but I see that she is still very much on top. These are challenging times, which is not saying very much, really. And I would say the basic ingredients of the Israeli-American relationship, whether it's shared values, whether it's strategic interests, whether it's the Jewish community, the basic ingredients, I think, have not changed, which is a good thing. But there are ups and downs, and well, I'm not so sanguine about what's happening in the American Democratic Party, but I won't expect you to make any comments about that, because I'm not very sanguine about what's happening on these campuses in Israel sometimes. So I won't go into that at the present time. Some people say, you know, foreign relations, the relations between Israel and the United States, it's wheels within wheels. Okay, it's wheels within wheels, but really on certain issues, the wheels are separate and not necessarily turning in the right direction. Certainly not on Iran. On the Russian issues, so-so. Let's put it like that. They're not completely contradictory, but they're not completely in harmony. For us, Syria is closer than the Ukraine. Now, about, I thought we are not going to go into the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but there are certain mantras, I would call them totems, on both sides, on all three sides. And in America, it's usually, I used to hear that day and night, the present situation is unsustainable. I don't know how many times I used to hear that from Madeleine Albright, and this was one of her favorite statements. Well, it's been sustainable for over 50 years. It may be sustainable for another 50 years, who knows? The other totem is the two-state solution. Ms. Pelosi comes here, it's almost the first statement she makes. Now, I grant you that in principle, and perhaps in practice, the two-state solution is preferable by all counts to the one-state solution. For what Dennis said, for what you said, and so on, there's no doubt about that. I think few people in Israel, including in the thinking part of the opposition, think differently. I think they have the same view. But the two-state solution is not going to happen anytime soon, for the reasons Dennis said, for Israeli reasons, for the reason that, among other things, in the present configuration of the Middle East and the Palestinians, a Palestinian state would have meant now a Hamas state, perhaps a Hezbollah state, 12 minutes away from where we are sitting now. And that's not going to be acceptable to Israel. So it's not going to happen anytime soon. Sooner or later, one time, hopefully, we will have to find a solution of separation, call it two states. Now there's a new fashion to call it two entities. Okay, I would say perhaps a reinforced autonomy, but we're more or less going, I would say, in the same direction. It should be clear to our American friends that right now the two-state solution as an immediate policy acceptance or policy step is not relevant. It's not on the table right now. We should more concentrate on some of the other issues which you mentioned, because I do believe that there has been a major breakthrough with the Abraham Accords, which can work in the direction of the Palestinians. That's my hope. Just to say to you again, welcome. You have your job cut out for yourself without any doubt, but we are very happy with your appointment. And on the Palestinian issue, just one further word. There's one person who made a very correct statement. His name is President Biden. President Biden said, he was already president, he was not a candidate running for office, there will be no peace between Israel and its neighbors, or in the Middle East, till Israel's neighbors recognize the Jewish people's right to a state of their own. That's exactly the situation as it is. And I'm sure American diplomats will be able to help as much as they can, but basically it depends on our Arab neighbors and on ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Juval. Before the Ambassador of America has to leave, we have one more quick word from former Ambassador Dana Yarone.
A very quick word. First of all, welcome to Ambassador Nides. I'm sure by now you feel at home. And of course, Ambassador Ross is one of us. You should feel you are at home and an honorary Israeli. First of all, I want to say that I agree totally about what you said about each other. And Ruth, a great job of moderation. We divided the work. So Ambassador Juval supplied the answer. I will have a question. And the one is, in the absence of an agreement in Vienna, I mean, at this point, we do not know how the events in Ukraine affect the Iranians, whether they will accelerate and want to sign now or whether they will postpone. So in the event of postponement, would the United States be willing to consider a military response operation in Iran? And if there is an agreement, would the United States throw its weight around like they did with NATO very successfully and brilliantly, also to have the Europeans, I don't put any faith in China or Russia, but the Europeans and the Americans to put pressure in real terms on Iran vis-a-vis their ballistic missile and terror efforts.
So Ambassador Nides, please answer the question and also add to this your closing remarks.
Let me just say, all options will be on the table. Second, first of all, thank you very much. Listen, the opportunity to be on a stage with Dennis it's almost worth being ambassador for, and being away from my family. So I'm honored to share this, and obviously, Ruth, thank you very much. I just want to end where I began. My job as ambassador, as Dennis knows, is to represent the United States of America. What a great honor, right? To come here as an American Jew, as someone who grew up as a young as 7 kids from a little town in Minnesota, to come here and represent the United States of America in a country that we're so close to, that at every level it's in our soul. So I am just honored to be here with all of you. but just to say, listen, we're in this together. We're in this together in the good times and, yes, in the bad times. But we're in this together. So thank you all very much for having me. Thank you.
Dennis?
A real pleasure to be with Tom, as I said. And, what I said about him, he revealed to you. You were lucky to have him, and Israel's lucky to have him, and America's lucky to have him here as our ambassador. To answer your second part of your question, we've seen a change in Europe, and it'll be interesting to see if that transformation is something that applies not only to Russia but elsewhere. Has there been a kind of wake-up call that says, we're going to draw a distinction, no more moral relativism. Where we see evil, we're going to call it out. So there's an opportunity. Whether it'll happen, I don't know. But I think there may be an opportunity there, and I hope it's the case. And I'll just close by saying what, Ruth, you said earlier, and then Tom, in a sense, said the same thing in slightly different words. I'll put it this way. The United States is not defensive about its relationship with Israel. And it's not defensive about its relationship with Israel because it knows it's a partnership that's built on values and interests. And that's what makes it enduring.
Very good. Thank you. We are in it together for the good time and for the bad time is an excellent message to end up this evening. We are very lucky to have both of you in our life, you permanently and Dennis on both sides of the island in different capacities. And I want to thank very much Yedidia and the JPPI for having this evening. Thank you very much.